Vanessa Cole pressed her lips against Damien Draven's mouth like she owned him. That was the first thing Elena saw when she stepped off the elevator into the penthouse. Not her husband pulling away, not surprise crossing his face, but Vanessa's perfectly manicured hand curled around the back of Damien's neck, pulling him closer. And Damien, the man Elena had given 8 years of her life to, standing there in the kitchen he'd had renovated because Elena said she loved morning light, standing there and not stopping it. Elena's hand went to her coat pocket. The ultrasound photo was still there, still warm from where she'd been holding it the entire cab ride over, rehearsing what she was going to say. "We're having twins, Damien. 2 of them." She didn't say it. She didn't say anything. She stood in the doorway of her own home and listened to her best friend and her husband decide her future without her. "The council won't wait past spring," Vanessa was saying, pulling back just enough to speak, her lipstick barely smudged. "Elena's a liability. She doesn't understand this world. She never did. Mira Castellano's daughter is 26. Her father controls the eastern shipping routes, and she's already been briefed on what marriage to you would mean." "I know what it would mean," Damien said. His voice was flat. Not the voice of a man who'd just kissed someone he shouldn't have, the voice of a man running calculations. "Then stop stalling." Vanessa touched his jaw. "Elena is a beautiful mistake you made when you thought you could have a normal life. You can't. You never could." Damien said nothing. That silence was the thing that broke Elena open. If you have ever stood in a room where the people who mattered most to you forgot you existed, leave a comment below with your city and your country. I want to know how far this story has traveled. And if you believe Elena deserved better, hit that like button right now. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens when a woman who has lost everything decides she has nothing left to protect, except 2 lives she hasn't told anyone about yet. Because what Elena does in the next 60 seconds will change every single thing that follows. The ultrasound was dated that morning. 8 weeks, 2 gestational sacs, both measuring on track. The technician had printed 3 copies, and Elena had folded all of them into her coat pocket because she couldn't stop touching them, couldn't stop reminding herself they were real. She was still touching one when she stepped back from the elevator doorway and pressed the down button with the knuckle of her left hand so it wouldn't make a sound. The doors opened immediately. She stepped in. She watched Damien and Vanessa through the narrowing gap until the panels closed and took them away from her. She did not cry in the elevator. She counted the floors instead. 31. 30. 29. She got to 19 before her knees went soft, and she put her back against the mirrored wall and slid down until she was sitting on the floor of the elevator in her good coat, the one Damien had bought her in Milan, holding a photograph of 2 small gray circles that were somehow already people. The lobby doors opened. A man in a suit looked down at her and had the decency to look away. Elena got up. She smoothed her coat. She walked out through the lobby of the Draven building, past the concierge who knew her name, past the doorman who held the door, and out onto 5th Avenue where the November wind hit her face so hard her eyes watered immediately, and she was grateful for it because it meant no one could tell if she was crying. She was not going back up there. She understood that in the same way you understand something that has always been true, but that you kept choosing not to look at directly. Like a door at the end of a hallway you kept telling yourself you'd check later. She had checked it now. She knew what was behind it. The cab she flagged down smelled like pine air freshener and old upholstery. She gave the driver her attorney's address on West 48th and then sat with her hands in her lap and her coat buttoned all the way to her throat, and thought about the anniversary dinner Damien had texted her about that morning. Reservations at 8. Wear the blue dress. I have something to tell you. She wondered what he'd been planning to tell her. She decided it didn't matter. What? Margaret Hale was a divorce attorney who'd been recommended to Elena 3 years ago by a colleague who'd said, "If you ever need her, you'll know why I'm giving you this number." Elena had stored the number in her phone under M and never thought about it again until she was standing outside a brownstone on West 48th with her finger hovering over the contact. Margaret answered on the second ring. She did not sound surprised. She was not available that evening, but she could clear her 9 o'clock the following morning. She asked one question. "Are you safe right now?" Elena said yes. She wasn't sure that was true, but she said it. She walked to the hotel 3 blocks over. Not the kind of hotel she normally stayed in, not somewhere Damien's people would think to look. And she paid cash for a room on the 7th floor, and she sat on the edge of the bed with her coat still on, and she made a list. The list was short. She was the kind of person who had always been better with lists than with crying. Crying took too long. She wrote, attorney, morning, documents. She wrote, bank, joint account, transfer portion, do not clean it out. She wrote, call no one. She underlined that one. She wrote, main, and then looked at that word for a long time before she added a question mark. Her phone buzzed. Damien. Running late at the office. Still on for 8? She turned the phone face down on the bedspread and looked at the ceiling. The room was beige. The kind of beige that isn't trying to be anything. She appreciated that. She pulled the ultrasound photo from her pocket and smoothed it flat on her knee. The twins were the size of raspberries. The technician had said they had heartbeats she could see on the monitor, 2 separate small flickering pulses. And Elena had gripped the paper gown so hard it tore at the edge. She hadn't told the technician. She'd just nodded and tried to look like a woman who was not completely overwhelmed. She was overwhelmed now. She let herself be overwhelmed for exactly 10 minutes. She counted it on the clock radio on the nightstand, the red digital numbers, and when it hit 10 minutes, she sat up and wiped her face with the back of her hand and started thinking practically. The twins changed everything. That was both the terror and the anchor. She could not make decisions from rage or from grief. She had 2 heartbeats to think about now, 2 small flickering pulses that had nothing to do with Damien's empire or Vanessa's ambitions or the Mafia Council's succession politics. 2 people who needed her to be clear-headed. She would be clear-headed. She put the photo back in her pocket. She ordered soup from room service because she hadn't eaten since morning, and she ate it sitting cross-legged on the bed, and she did not think about the blue dress hanging in her closet at the penthouse, the one Damien had told her to wear. She thought about Maine, about a town she'd driven through once on a road trip before she'd met Damien, a small place on the coast where the houses were old and the people minded their business, and the water was cold enough to clear your head of absolutely everything. She had thought, driving through that town at 24 years old with nothing particular to worry about, I could live there. She hadn't thought about it again until tonight. Margaret Hale's office had the kind of deliberate calm that expensive legal work produces. Good wood, no clutter, degrees on the wall spaced with architectural precision. Margaret herself was in her 50s with gray hair she hadn't bothered to color, and the kind of stillness that came from having heard every version of every bad situation a marriage could produce. She listened to Elena for 11 minutes without interrupting. Then she said, "You didn't confront him." "No." "You didn't take anything from the apartment." "Just what I had with me." Margaret made a note. "The joint account. You said you moved some funds." "A third. I left 2/3. That was restrained of you." "I wasn't trying to hurt him financially." Margaret looked up. "What were you trying to do?" Elena thought about it. "Leave a door I could close cleanly. You understand his attorneys will be considerably more aggressive than you're being. I know what his attorneys are capable of." She did. She'd sat across the dinner table from them. She knew which one took his coffee with 2 sugars, and which one had a daughter at Dalton, and which one had built a second reputation that had nothing to do with the law. She knew exactly what she was stepping into. She said, "I need the filing to be airtight. I need grounds that don't require testimony from me about his business. I saw enough in 8 years to make things very complicated for a lot of people. I don't want to do that. I want a clean exit." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Irreconcilable differences." "Yes. You're not going to seek discovery on his assets." "No." "Elena." Margaret set down her pen. "You are entitled to a significant settlement." "I know." Elena folded her hands on the desk. "File it the way I'm asking." Another pause. "Is there anything else I should know? Anything that might affect the filing or your safety?" Elena looked at the window behind Margaret's head. The morning light was coming in at a low angle, November light, the kind that made everything look provisional and temporary. "No," she said. She was lying. But she told herself it was the right kind of lie. The kind you tell to protect something that isn't ready to exist in the world yet, something too new and too fragile to survive being mentioned in a law office while divorce papers were being drafted. She signed what Margaret put in front of her. She shook Margaret's hand. She walked out into the cold. The ring came off on the sidewalk outside Margaret's building. She hadn't planned it. She'd been walking, her breath making small clouds in the air, and her left hand had been in her coat pocket, and her thumb had found the ring the way it always did. The old habit, rubbing the edge of the band when she was thinking hard about something. And before she'd made any conscious decision, her hand was out of her pocket and the ring was between her fingers. She looked at it, princess cut, platinum, the stone a shade of blue-white that Damien had described to the jeweler for 40 minutes, because he'd been trying to match the color of the winter sky over the Hudson on the morning they'd first kissed. She'd thought that was excessive at the time. She'd also thought it was the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for her. She stood on the sidewalk on West 48th Street and held the ring and thought about a version of herself that had believed the story of the winter sky and the Hudson. She didn't hate that version of herself. She just couldn't be her anymore. She walked to the corner mailbox, the battered blue USPS mailbox outside the deli, and she almost laughed at herself because she didn't have an envelope. So she went into the deli and asked for an envelope, and the man behind the counter looked at her like she was slightly insane, but found her one, and she bought a stamp from the little machine and addressed the envelope to the penthouse on Fifth Avenue and wrote no return address and dropped the ring inside and sealed it and dropped it in the mailbox. Damien would get it in 2 to 3 business days. By then, she would be gone. She told no one. That was the part that cost her most. She had a mother in Connecticut who would have driven to the city the moment Elena called, who would have shown up with food and opinions and a ferocious protective anger that Elena actually could have used right now. She had 2 colleagues at the architecture firm who were close enough to call friends. She had her book club on Thursday nights, and a neighbor who kept a spare key and watered her plants when she traveled. She told none of them. She understood that Damien's network was not a metaphor. His people were genuinely everywhere, not in a paranoid way, just in the way that a man who had spent 15 years building an organization understood infrastructure. He would know she'd visited Margaret Hale. He would probably know within the week. She had maybe a 3-day head start before his security chief started pulling threads. She used all 3 days. She closed her email and opened a new one under a name that wasn't hers. She paid cash for a secondhand car in Queens from a private seller who didn't ask questions. She packed 2 bags, practical things, warm things, the kind of packing you do when you're not sure how long you'll be somewhere, but you know it's going to be cold. She put the ultrasound photos in a waterproof document case. She drove north out of the city on a Tuesday morning when the traffic was still heavy enough that anyone following her would have trouble. And she didn't stop until Connecticut, where she ate a sandwich in a diner parking lot and called her mother from a payphone because she'd remembered that diners sometimes still had them, and she needed to hear her mother's voice even if she couldn't explain why. Her mother answered. Elena said, "I'm okay. I just wanted to say I love you." Her mother said, "Elena, what's wrong?" "Nothing. I'll call you when I can." "That's not nothing." She hung up. She sat in the car with her hands on the wheel and the sandwich half-eaten on the seat beside her, and she thought, "I'm sorry." Not to Damien. To her mother, who deserved more than that. And to the 2 small heartbeats that deserved more than a woman sitting in a parking lot talking to herself and trying not to fall apart. She drove the rest of the way to Maine in one push, stopping only for gas, arriving after dark to the coastal town she'd thought about for 12 years since driving through it once on a road trip. It was smaller than she remembered. The main street had a hardware store and a bakery and a library that looked like it had been there since the Civil War. The woman at the rental office was named Ruth, and she had the manner of someone who had lived in a small town long enough to not be surprised by people arriving after dark with cash and no explanation. She showed Elena 3 properties. Elena took the one furthest from the main road, a small white house with good windows and a yard that backed up to the tree line and a kitchen big enough to actually cook in. She carried her 2 bags inside. She stood in the empty living room. The house was quiet in a way that the city never was. Not silence exactly. She could hear the wind and something moving in the yard, and somewhere further off what might have been the ocean. Just quiet. The kind of quiet you have to stop moving to hear. She put her hand on her stomach. "Okay," she said, to herself or to them, or to no one in particular. "Okay. We're here." She did not know yet how long okay would last. She did not know that within 24 hours of her departure, Damien Draven would return to the penthouse to find it stripped of her presence, not emptied, just missing, the way a room feels when the person who made it real has gone. She did not know that Vanessa Cole was already preparing for that moment, had been preparing for it with a patience and calculation that made the staged kiss in the kitchen look like improvisation. She did not know that by the time the divorce papers arrived at the penthouse, Vanessa would already have placed forged documents inside Damien's security files, documents that would make Elena's exit look premeditated, calculated, treacherous. She did not know any of that yet. She just knew the house was quiet, and she was here, and she was not going back. She made tea with the kettle she found in one of the cabinets. Someone had left it behind, along with 2 mismatched mugs and a tin of Earl Grey. And she sat at the kitchen table with her coat still on because the heat hadn't kicked up yet, and she drank the tea and she looked at the ultrasound photo she'd propped against the salt shaker. 2 small gray circles. 2 heartbeats she'd heard that morning on a monitor in a clinic on the Upper East Side, a lifetime and 1 day ago. "I don't know what I'm doing," she told them, which was the most honest thing she'd said out loud in 24 hours. "But I'm going to figure it out." The heat clicked on. The house settled around her. Outside, the Maine coast wind moved through the trees at the edge of the yard, the branches scraping against each other in the dark, a sound like someone whispering in a language just beyond understanding. Elena finished her tea. She washed the mug. She went to bed. She slept, which surprised her, deeply and without dreaming. The way you sleep when your body finally understands that it's the only one in charge now and it has work to do. Damien came home at 9:17. He knew the exact time because he checked his watch on the elevator ride up, calculating whether he still had time to change before the restaurant. They were 12 minutes from the reservation, and Elena was always ready before him, always waiting in the living room with her coat already on, and that particular expression she wore when she was pretending not to be impatient. The elevator opened into the penthouse. The lights were on. The apartment was empty. Not dark empty, not the kind of empty that means someone stepped out for a moment. The kind of empty that has weight to it. He stood in the entrance and felt it before he understood it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before the storm actually arrives. "Elena?" His voice landed flat. No echo, no response, just the sound of the city 31 floors below doing what it always did, indifferent. He walked through the apartment slowly, the way he moved through spaces he wasn't sure were secure, and he noticed things in pieces. Her coat hooks were bare. The reading glasses she kept on the kitchen counter were gone. The photograph she kept on the nightstand showed her and her mother at the Connecticut house, summer light, both of them laughing at something just outside the frame, was gone, and the outline where it had sat was visible in the slight variation of dust. He opened her closet. Gaps. Not emptied. She hadn't taken everything, but the gaps were deliberate. The things she actually wore, the practical things, the warm things. The blue dress was still there, the one he'd told her to wear tonight. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the closet for a long time. His phone had 4 missed calls from the restaurant. He didn't call them back. He called Elena instead. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail, and he listened to her recorded voice tell him she couldn't come to the phone right now, and he hung up without leaving a message and called again immediately. 6 rings. Voicemail. He hung up. He called Marcus Webb, his security chief, on the second line. Marcus answered before the first ring finished. That was the thing about Marcus. He answered like he'd been waiting, like sleep was something that happened to other people. "She's gone," Damien said. A pause. "How long?" "I don't know. Hours, maybe. She took not everything. Some things. I'll start pulling." "Don't flag it internally yet." Damien stood up. He was still in his suit. "Just you. Nothing on the network." Another pause, longer this time. "You think it's internal?" "I don't know what I think." He walked to the window. The city glittered below him with the cheerful indifference of a thing that didn't care who stood at which window looking down at it. "Just find her." He did not sleep that night. He sat at his desk and worked through the files that always needed working through, the kind of administrative weight that a man in his position never fully escaped, and he drank 2 glasses of scotch slowly, and he did not let himself think about the blue dress hanging in the closet or the empty hook by the door. He had built his entire adult life around the principle that emotion was information, but not instruction. You felt what you felt, you noted it, you did not let it drive. That was how you survived. That was how you kept the people around you alive. He noted that his chest felt like something was sitting on it. He did not let it drive. The divorce papers arrived on Thursday via a courier that Marcus's people traced back to a law office on West 48th. Margaret Hale, family law, 14 years in practice, the kind of attorney people hired when they wanted something done quietly and completely. Damien read through the filing twice at his desk. Irreconcilable differences. No claims on assets, no discovery requests, no demands beyond a clean legal separation. He set the papers down and stared at the wall. Vanessa arrived 20 minutes later, which told him she'd been watching for this, or that she had a source inside his building, which he filed away as a problem to address separately. She came in through the private entrance off the garage, the one only 6 people had access to, and she sat across from his desk in the chair he kept for meetings, where he didn't want people to feel comfortable. She looked at the papers on his desk without touching them. "She planned this," Vanessa said. It wasn't a question. "You don't know that." "Damien," she crossed her legs. She was wearing gray today, the kind of composed, expensive gray that looked like restraint but wasn't. "I've been trying to tell you for months. Elena has never been comfortable with your world. The pressure you're under from the council, the marriage question. I think she saw an opening and she took it. I think she's been planning this longer than you want to believe. She didn't take her jewelry. She took what she needed. She left what she knew you'd notice. That's not impulsive, Damien. That's calculated." He looked at her. He'd known Vanessa for 11 years. He knew the specific architecture of her face when she was managing him, the particular calm, the measured pace of her words, the way she leaned forward just slightly when she wanted him to feel like she was being honest with him instead of performing honesty. He was looking at that architecture right now. He said, "What do you want, Vanessa?" She blinked. "I want to help you." "You want to help me?" He picked up the papers. She didn't fight. She didn't make demands. She asked for nothing. "Does that sound like a woman who is planning to clean me out?" "It sounds like a woman who knows she can't win a direct fight and is setting up for something else." Vanessa's voice stayed even. "The council is watching this closely. A messy public dissolution would be damaging right now. What you need is, don't." He said it quietly, the kind of quiet that closed doors. "Don't tell me what I need." She stood. She straightened her jacket. She said, "I'm just trying to protect you." He didn't answer. After she left, he poured another 2 fingers of scotch, and he did not drink it, and he sat there looking at the documents on his desk, and he thought about the look on Vanessa's face, and he thought about Elena's empty coat hooks, and he thought, something is wrong, and I cannot see it clearly because I am standing too close to it. He had thought that before in operational contexts. In his world, that thought was a survival instinct. He'd learned to trust it. He did not know yet how badly he'd failed to trust it here. Marcus Webb came to him with the first file on a Friday morning, 11 days after Elena's departure. It was thin. A printed summary, 3 pages. The kind of document Marcus produced when he wanted to present conclusions without showing all the methodology. Damien had taught him that discipline, lead with what matters, keep the source chain separate so it didn't become a distraction. "She visited the attorney's office the morning after she left," Marcus said, standing on the other side of Damien's desk with his hands at his sides. Marcus was 53, former military, the kind of built that had nothing to do with a gym and everything to do with decades of actual work. He was also the most precise person Damien had ever employed, meaning he didn't editorialize. The filing was same day. She had the attorney on speed dial. The contact was 3 years old. "That doesn't prove planning." "No." Marcus's jaw moved. "But there's more." The second page was a bank record, a partial withdrawal from the joint account, Elena's portion, exactly 1/3, transferred 2 days before she left. The timestamp put it at the same day Damien had been in Washington for a council meeting, the kind of all-day absence she would have known about. "The timing," Damien started. "I know how it looks," Marcus said. "How does it look?" "Like she was waiting for a window." Marcus said it flatly. He wasn't making an argument. He was reporting. Damien closed the file. He thought about the 3-year-old attorney contact. He thought about the withdrawal timed to his absence. He thought about the fact that she'd taken exactly the things she needed and left everything that would look like she'd stripped him. He thought about Vanessa saying, "That's not impulsive, that's calculated." He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He had a rule about this kind of convergence. When multiple independent data points started pointing in the same direction, you didn't dismiss it because you didn't like the direction. You followed the data. That was the discipline. He followed it now. He opened the file back up. He did not know, could not have known, because the methodology was exquisite, that the bank records Marcus was showing him had been marginally altered. Not the amounts, not the dates, just the timestamps. just enough to make the withdrawal look like it had been executed at 2:47 p.m. on the day of his Washington meeting instead of the actual time, which was 9:14 a.m. the day before, when Elena had still believed she was coming to the penthouse that night to tell her husband he was going to be a father. He did not know that the attorney contact in Elena's phone had been 3 years old because a colleague had passed it to her after her own divorce, and Elena had stored it and forgotten it, the way you stored numbers you hoped you'd never need. He did not know that Vanessa Cole had accessed his security system through a contact she'd cultivated for 2 years, specifically for this contingency, and that she'd spent 6 days after Elena's departure placing small, precise, professionally deniable alterations inside the files Marcus was now using to brief him. He just saw what the files showed him. And what the files showed him was a wife who had been preparing to leave him for months. He signed the divorce response that afternoon. His attorneys filed it on Monday. The marriage of Damian Draven and Elena Ashford had a legal end date now, pending the 90-day review period. He told himself it was just paperwork. He told himself it didn't mean anything he hadn't already decided. He was wrong about both things, but he wouldn't know that for a long time. Vanessa moved carefully. That was the thing about her, the thing Damian had always read as loyalty. She didn't rush. She had the patience of someone who understood that timing was architecture, that the right move at the wrong moment was the same as the wrong move. She waited 2 weeks after the divorce filing before she introduced Councilman Reyes's dinner idea. Low-key, she said. Just a small gathering at the Reyes estate in Westchester, key council members, a chance for Damian to demonstrate stability during what everyone knew was a difficult personal period. Mira Castellano would be there. Her father had requested it. Damian said, "I don't need a dinner." Vanessa said, "The council needs to see you functioning." "I am functioning." "You've canceled 3 meetings in 2 weeks, Damian. You've pulled back on the Eastern expansion. Reyes is telling people you're compromised." Reyes says a lot of things. He says them to people whose support you need. She sat down without being invited, which was a thing she'd started doing more often in the past 2 weeks. 1 dinner, 2 hours. Let them see you're not falling apart. He looked at her across the desk. "Are you asking me as a friend?" he said. "Or are you asking me on behalf of whoever told you to arrange this?" Something moved behind her eyes. Fast, like a fish turning underwater, there and then gone. "I'm asking you as someone who has spent 11 years making sure your interests are protected," she said, "the same way I'm protecting them now." He went to the dinner. He stood in the Reyes library with a drink he didn't touch and made the appropriate conversation with the appropriate people. And when Mira Castellano was introduced to him by her father, he shook her hand and said pleasure. And she was 26 and entirely composed, and clearly had been briefed thoroughly on both what this dinner was and what her father wanted it to produce. She was not unpleasant. That almost made it worse. On the drive home, sitting in the back of the car with the privacy partition up, he thought about Elena at 26, not poised in a library, but standing in his office doorway the day they'd met, making an argument about structural load-bearing calculations for a renovation project he'd commissioned, completely unintimidated, referring to him as Mr. Draven with the specific cadence of someone who'd decided to be professional rather than impressed. He'd thought, who is this woman? He'd thought it for 8 years after that. He pressed his fist against his mouth and looked at the highway through the tinted window and thought, find her, you idiot. Just find her. But Marcus's files were sitting on his desk, and the divorce papers were filed, and Vanessa was already talking to Reyes's people about a spring timeline. And Damian had built an entire life around the principle that you don't chase what is already chosen to leave. He had never hated that principle more than he did right now. But Marcus Webb was not a man who brought problems he hadn't already started working on. He came to Damian in the 3rd week of December, 41 days after Elena's departure, and he stood in the doorway of the private office for a moment before he came in and closed the door, which was a tell. Marcus didn't hesitate in doorways unless he was arranging his words carefully. "Talk to me," Damian said. "The bank timestamps." Marcus sat. He set a folder on the desk. "I had them run through an independent verification. Different analyst, no context, just the raw files." Damian opened the folder. "They were altered," Marcus said. "Not the numbers, the metadata. Whoever did it was good. This isn't something you'd catch in a standard review. The actual transfer happened 17 hours earlier than the files indicated." Damian read the verification report. He read it again. So she didn't time it to my Washington trip, he said. She couldn't have. The transfer completed before you left. Marcus paused. Which means she wasn't watching for a window. Which means the framing we were working from was wrong. Damien closed the folder. He set it on the desk very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady and you don't want anyone to see that. Who altered them? That's what I've been working on. Marcus's voice stayed flat, but there was something underneath it. Not anger exactly, but the specific tension of a man who has discovered something that changes the shape of everything he thought he was working on. I need more time, but Damien... He stopped. Say it. The access was internal. The modifications required someone inside your security infrastructure. Not many people have that clearance. The silence in the room had texture. How many? Damien said. 6. Are you on the list? Marcus looked at him steadily. Yes? Did you do it? No. I believe you. And he did, immediately, without needing to think about it. Marcus Webb was the most incorruptible man he'd ever employed. Incorruptible not through ideology, but through a deep, almost constitutional aversion to complication. Marcus liked clean operations. Falsified evidence was the opposite of clean. Cross yourself off the list. Work the other 5. I'm already working them. How long? A week, maybe 2. Faster. Marcus stood. He picked up the folder. At the door he paused, again, in the doorway, and said, If I'm right about what I'm finding, if this goes where I think it goes. He stopped. Say it, Marcus. Elena didn't leave because she wanted to. The words sat in the room. Damien's jaw was tight enough that he could feel it in his temples. She left because someone made her believe she had to. That's what the timestamps suggest. What else do the timestamps suggest? Marcus was quiet for 3 seconds. That whatever she saw that night, whatever made her walk out of here, it may not have been what it looked like. Damien thought about the penthouse, the empty coat hooks, the ring that had arrived by mail in a plain envelope with no return address, and that he'd been keeping in his desk drawer because he couldn't make himself put it anywhere else. He thought about what it may not have been what it looked like might mean. His chest did the thing again. The pressure, the weight of something that had no name that he was willing to say out loud yet. Find the source, he said. Whatever you need. Whatever it costs. Find it. Marcus left. Damien opened his desk drawer and took out the ring and set it on the desk in front of him, the platinum band catching the lamplight, the blue-white stone sitting there small and still and utterly indifferent to everything that had happened since the last time it was worn. He sat with it for a long time. Outside his window, December was dismantling the last of the fall, the trees stripped bare, the city gray and functional in the particular way it got when the holidays were close but hadn't arrived yet. He thought about Elena in Maine. Marcus's preliminary search had narrowed the geography, hadn't found her yet, but had narrowed it. In whatever house she'd found, in whatever version of a life she was constructing without him. He thought about whether she was warm enough. He thought about whether she was eating. He thought about these things and then felt a specific contempt for himself for thinking them, because they were the thoughts of a man who had spent the past 41 days letting Vanessa Cole sit in his office and manage his grief, letting falsified files convince him that the woman he'd loved for 8 years had been running a calculated exit strategy, letting a dinner in Westchester put him in the same room as another woman's daughter and call it practical. He picked up his phone. He did not call Elena. He'd already decided he didn't have the right to do that yet. Not until he knew more, not until he had something to say that wasn't just the noise of his own guilt. He called Vanessa instead. She answered on the 3rd ring, warm, ready, the voice she used when she was expecting the call she'd set up. Damien, I was just thinking about you. I need you in the office tomorrow, he said. 8 a.m. Of course. Should I? Don't prepare anything, he said. Just come. A pause. Short but real. Is everything all right? I'll see you at 8, he said, and hung up. He set the ring on top of the closed folder. He thought about Marcus's face in the doorway, the specific quality of restraint on a man who had just figured out that the building he was standing in was not structurally sound. He thought about 6 people with the clearance to access his security infrastructure. He thought about 11 years of proximity. He thought about, I'm just trying to protect you, delivered with perfect steadiness by a woman who had never once flinched under his gaze, Not in 11 years. Not until the moment he'd said, "What do you want?" Vanessa, and watched something move behind her eyes like a fish turning under dark water. He had noted it then. He understood it now. The weight on his chest didn't lift. It changed character. Shifted from grief into something colder and more purposeful. The kind of thing he recognized from operational contexts. From the moments when a situation clarified from something messy and emotional into something that required precision and patience and the willingness to take it completely apart. He was good at taking things apart. He had not yet let himself think about what happened after, about Elena in Maine, about 41 days of silence she hadn't deserved, about whatever it was she'd come to tell him on the night everything shattered, the thing she'd walked away with in her pocket and never said. He would think about that later. First, he was going to find out exactly how deep this went, and exactly who was in it, and he was going to be methodical, and he was going to be thorough, and he was going to give Marcus the week he'd asked for, even though every instinct in him wanted to move right now. And then, when he knew everything, he was going to make a series of decisions that could not be undone. He was almost certain he was already too late for some of them. He was right. Vanessa arrived at 8 o'clock exactly. That was the first thing Damien noted. Not 8:02, not 7:58. 8 o'clock on the second, the way you arrive when you have spent the night deciding how to walk into a room. She had dressed carefully. Not expensively, she was always expensive, but carefully. The particular gray wool coat, the minimal jewelry, the expression calibrated to project composed concern, the look of a trusted colleague arriving to help manage a difficult period. She sat down across from his desk without being invited, the way she'd been doing for weeks now. He let her sit. He did not offer coffee. He did not say good morning. He set a single photograph on the desk between them and turned it to face her and watched her face. The photograph was a still from a security camera in the building's server room. The timestamp read 11:43 p.m., 6 days after Elena's departure. The figure in the frame was wearing a maintenance uniform and a cap pulled low, but the jawline was wrong for maintenance and the posture was wrong. And the hand reaching toward the secondary terminal was wearing a ring that Damien's enhancement team had identified in 3 hours as a piece Vanessa had worn to the Reyes dinner in October. She looked at the photograph for 4 seconds. Then she looked up at him. Her face did not collapse. That was the thing he would remember afterward. She did not collapse. She did not go pale. She did not do any of the things a person does when they are caught and know it. What she did instead was almost worse. She took a breath through her nose, slow and controlled, and her expression shifted from composed concern into something that was almost resignation, except cleaner than resignation, more considered, like a chess player who has just watched the opponent find the move she'd been hoping they'd miss. "How long?" he said. "Does it matter?" "How long, Vanessa?" She looked at the window behind his head. "The council started talking about the succession problem 3 years ago. Reyes brought me in 18 months ago. The Castellano Alliance—" "You went to Reyes." "Reyes came to me." She said it evenly. "I want you to understand the difference." "I don't care about the difference." "You should." She looked back at him. "Reyes would have moved against you regardless. What I did, coming to me first, shaping it, I kept it surgical. I kept you functional. I kept— You staged the kiss." A pause. "Yes." "In my kitchen." "Yes." "You knew she was coming that night." Something shifted in Vanessa's face. Microscopic. The first real crack, and it came there. Not at the accusation of conspiracy, not at the photograph, but there, at the question of the night. "We knew you'd called her, the reservation. I thought she'd be at the restaurant by—" "She came early." His voice was flat as sheet metal. "She came to surprise me." "I didn't know she'd come early." "But she did, and she stood in my doorway and she watched you." He stood up. He needed to stand up because sitting still was no longer possible. "And she left. And you watched her leave and you didn't say anything." "Damien, what did she come to tell me?" Vanessa blinked. "What?" "She came early. She had something to tell me. She came in person instead of calling, which she would have done if it were ordinary." "What did she come to tell me?" "I don't know what—" "Don't." He said it quietly, but the room changed temperature. "Don't tell me you don't know. Your people were watching her. You had eyes on this building. What did she come to tell me that night?" The silence stretched. Outside, the December city moved through its morning with total indifference. I don't know, Vanessa said, and for the first time since she'd sat down, he thought it might actually be true. Whatever it wasn't in our intelligence. She'd been to a clinic that morning. One of our contacts flagged it, but we didn't have details on the visit. We weren't tracking her a clinic, a private clinic on the Upper East Side, OBGYN practice. The air went out of Damien's lungs. Not dramatically. It didn't knock him back. It didn't make him grab the desk. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of thing that happens to your breathing when a piece of information lands and your body understands it 3 seconds before your mind catches up. An OBGYN clinic. The night she'd come early, the way she'd had something to tell him in person. He sat back down. He sat very still. She was pregnant, he said. It wasn't a question. Vanessa said nothing. Look at me, he said. She looked at him. She was pregnant. I didn't know for certain, Vanessa said. Not that night. We found out 6 weeks later through the clinics. You found out. Something in his chest was doing something he didn't have a word for. 6 weeks later. You found out and you said nothing. The council's position. She was carrying my child. The inheritance structure means any biological. She was carrying my child. His voice didn't rise. It dropped. It went somewhere below the floor of the room. And you knew, and you said nothing. For how long? How long have you known? Damien, listen to me. How long? 7 weeks. We've known for 7 weeks. 7 weeks. Elena had been alone in Maine. Wherever in Maine. Whatever small house she'd found, whatever life she was building with no support and no safety net, for 7 weeks more than she'd needed to be. 7 weeks of a pregnancy she was navigating alone, while Vanessa Cole sat in his office in her gray wool coat and managed his grief and arranged dinners in Westchester. He pressed his knuckles against the surface of the desk, hard enough that the bones complained. How far along? Vanessa hesitated. The clinic records indicated, how far along is she? 8 weeks at time of visit. Vanessa's voice had lost its architecture. Not collapsed. She wasn't capable of collapse, but the calibration was gone. She was just talking now, just answering, which would put her at approximately 7 months. Around there, yes. 7 months. 7 months pregnant, alone. In Maine in December. He stood up again. He walked to the window. He put his hand flat against the cold glass and looked at the city and breathed through his nose the way you breathe when you are trying to prevent something that is happening inside you from becoming something that is visible outside you. He did not entirely succeed. Get out, he said. Damien, the council is not going to... Get out of my building. Get your people out of my building. You have 20 minutes before Marcus starts moving them out himself, and I promise you that will be less comfortable than leaving voluntarily. If you move against Reyes now without a plan... He turned from the window. Whatever was on his face made her stop talking. She had known him for 11 years, and she stopped talking mid-sentence and stood up and picked up her bag and walked to the door. At the door she stopped. Old habit, maybe. Or something else. She said, For what it's worth. Don't, he said. She left. He stood at the window for 4 minutes. He counted them on the clock on the wall, the same way Elena had counted floors in the elevator, though he didn't know that. Then he called Marcus. Marcus came with 3 people Damien trusted, not the most senior members of his organization, but the ones whose loyalty had been tested in ways that left no ambiguity. He sat them in the conference room and he laid it out without performance, just the facts in the order they occurred, and when he finished he said Histoire, Reyes, Castellano, Vega, and whoever else Vanessa brought in. I need names. I need documentation. I need it built in a way that the legitimate board can review it and act on it without my direct involvement. Because if I do this myself, it looks like a power move, and I need it to look like what it actually is. Which is, said Carver, the youngest of the 3, 29, good with numbers and better with pressure. A conspiracy against the organization's founding charter. Damien set the server room photograph on the table. They manipulated the CEO's personal situation to influence succession. That's not internal politics. That's actionable. Build me something I can take to the legitimate board. Timeline? Marcus said. 48 hours. No one in the room said that was unreasonable. That was one of the things Damien had always understood about the people he kept close. When he said a thing was necessary, they responded to the necessity, not to the comfort of the task. "There's something else," Damien said. He looked at Marcus specifically. "Elena. She's in Maine. I need a location. I've narrowed it to 2 counties. Give me today." Marcus held his gaze. Today. "She's 7 months pregnant." He said it without inflection, the way you say a fact that is too large to hold any tone. "She's been alone for 2 months. I need to know she's safe before I do anything else." Something moved through Marcus's face. Not sentiment. Marcus wasn't built for sentiment, but something that might have been the professional equivalent of it. A recognition of weight. Understood. They dispersed. Damien went back to his office and sat at his desk and did not look at the ring. He had made a mistake of extraordinary magnitude. He had done it through pride and through the kind of compartmentalization that kept a man functional in his world and slowly destroyed everything adjacent to that world. He had taken Vanessa's architecture at face value because it aligned with the conclusions his pride had already started drawing, because it was easier to believe Elena had planned to leave than to sit with the possibility that she had been pushed. He had believed the files because he needed a way to stop feeling what he'd been feeling since he walked into an empty apartment. That was on him. Not on Vanessa, not on Reyes, not on the Mafia Council or the inheritance laws or the Castellano Alliance. The conspiracy was on them. The believing of it was on him. He was going to have to hold both of those things at the same time, and he was going to have to do it without letting the guilt slow him down, because 7 months pregnant in a Maine winter was not an abstraction. He picked up the ring. He held it in his palm. "I'm coming," he said, to the empty office, to the ring, to nobody. "I don't know if it matters, but I'm coming." Marcus had a location by 2 in the afternoon, a rental property in a small coastal town, leased under a name that was 2 steps removed from Elena's but had her patterns in it. The preference for corner lots, the request for proximity to a library, the cash payment that the landlady had mentioned almost apologetically when Marcus's contact had asked about recent rentals by women traveling alone. He texted the address to Damien with a single line. "White House, tree line at the back. She has a car, older model Honda, Maine plates." Damien looked at the address for a long time. He did not leave immediately. He had things to finish first, things that couldn't wait, because the greatest mistake he could make right now was arriving on Elena's doorstep with the mess still uncontained behind him. She was safe at this moment. Marcus's contact had confirmed basic well-being. She was mobile. She was housed. She had been seen at the local clinic for prenatal appointments. Routine. Nothing alarming. She was managing. That was what Marcus's contact had said with the particular brevity of someone reporting good news in a bad context. She's managing. He hated that word. He wanted something better for her than managing. He went back to work. The 48 hours were brutal. He pulled Reyes's financial connections first. That was the cleanest, the most documentable, the kind of thing a legitimate board could hold in its hands without requiring explanation of context that would complicate the legal picture. Reyes had been moving organizational funds through 3 subsidiaries that had no operational justification, siphoning toward accounts in jurisdictions that told a story about where he expected to be living in 18 months. When Carver laid the full accounting on the table at midnight on the second night, even Marcus, who was not easily surprised, sat back in his chair and let out a slow breath. He was planning to be gone before the succession completed, Carver said. This isn't about installing Castellano's daughter. He was planning to take the liquidation and disappear. Which means the council position was a pretext, Marcus said. The council position was a pretext, Damien confirmed. Vanessa gave him the leverage to move against me, and in exchange, he gave her enough runway to position herself as the person managing the transition. She was never going to end up with Reyes. She was going to end up running whatever was left. And Elena. Elena was a variable that had to be removed. If she was pregnant, Damien's voice did the thing again, the going flat. The children would have full inheritance rights. Reyes couldn't liquidate with that claim outstanding. The room was very quiet. She wasn't just betrayed, Marcus said. She was a target. From before she knew about the pregnancy, maybe from before she was pregnant. Carver looked at the document spread across the table with the expression of a man recalculating the nature of the situation he'd agreed to be in. He was 29. He was good with numbers. He was possibly less prepared for the specific weight of this. The board meeting, he said. If we go to the legitimate board with this, Reyes loses his seat, loses his proxy votes, and the 3 council members he controls lose standing simultaneously, Damien said. The financial fraud alone is enough for external legal proceedings. That's their concern, not mine. What I need from the board is a formal resolution removing them from any influence over organizational succession. That's not going to happen quietly, Marcus said. It's not going to happen quietly, Damien agreed, but it's going to happen correctly. I'm not burning this down in a way that leaves smoke for Elena's children to breathe for the next 20 years. He said Elena's children and then caught himself and said nothing to correct it. Marcus noticed. He said nothing. The board meeting happened on a Thursday morning in a room on the 42nd floor with 7 people present and a document package that Carver had spent 36 hours making airtight. Damien presented it without emotion and with complete precision, and he answered every question put to him with the same flat clarity he used in any high-stakes operational context. When it was over and the votes were recorded and the formal removal of Councilman Reyes and his 2 allied members had been entered into the organizational record, Damien shook 4 hands, declined the lunch that was offered, and walked back to his office. He told Marcus to handle Vanessa's formal separation from the organization. He did not want to see her again. He did not want to be in the room when it happened because he did not trust what would be on his face. Marcus said, "And after? I'm going to Maine." "When?" "Tomorrow morning." He paused. "Early." "Damien?" Marcus stopped, which was unusual. "She's 7 months pregnant. She's been alone. Whatever you're planning to say, I don't have a plan for what to say." Marcus looked at him. "That might be the first honest thing you've said about this since it started. Don't push it." Marcus almost smiled. He didn't quite. "Drive safe." The night before he left, Damien sat in the penthouse for the last time. He was not sentimental about objects or spaces as a rule. The apartment was useful. It was positioned correctly. It served its function. But he walked through it that night with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with practicality. He stood in the kitchen where Vanessa had staged her scene with the precision of a director who understood exactly which angle would destroy the most. He stood in the doorway of what had been Elena's studio, where her drafting table still sat with its pencil groove worn into the wood from years of the same grip, where she'd left a roll of architectural drawings he hadn't been able to make himself discard. He unrolled the top one. A residential project, something she'd been working on before everything. A house, he realized. A family house, the kind you design because you're thinking about what comes next. 3 bedrooms on the upper floor. A garden-facing kitchen. Dimensions generous enough for people who intended to stay. He looked at it for a long time. He rolled it back up and put it under his arm. He packed 1 bag. He left before 6 in the morning, before the city was fully awake, the car loaded with the 1 bag and the rolled drawings and the ring in his coat pocket, where he'd put it because the desk drawer had been the wrong place for it, and he hadn't been able to identify the right place until now. The right place was his pocket. The wrong thing would be to act on that before he'd earned the right to. He drove north out of the city the same way Elena had driven, though he didn't know that. The same highway, the same Connecticut diner exit that she'd stopped at, the same narrowing of the road as Maine announced itself through the windshield in the form of darker sky and more trees and the particular quality of winter light that had nothing to do with the city. He thought about what he was going to say. He thought, "She is going to tell me to leave." He thought, "She will be right to tell me to leave." He thought, "I am going to leave when she tells me to, and I'm going to come back the next day. Because there is no version of this story where I let 7 months become 8 months, and then 9 months, and then a lifetime of her doing it alone, because I was too proud to stand in a doorway and take it." He thought about 2 small heartbeats on a monitor in a clinic on the Upper East Side, which he had not been present for, which Elena had ridden uptown to alone in a cab, and then ridden back down alone with 3 photographs in her coat pocket, heading to the penthouse to tell the person who should have been in that room with her. He was going to have to live with that. He was going to have to live with it in front of her, which was harder. The town appeared in the early afternoon the way small towns appear from highway exits. Suddenly, without ceremony, a main street and a hardware store and a library and the smell of salt air coming through the car's ventilation, even in December. He found the street from Marcus's description, found the White House with the tree line at the back, found the older Honda in the driveway with main plates, found himself parked at the curb with the engine off and his hands still on the wheel and nothing left to prepare. He sat in the car for 3 minutes. He was aware of the ring in his coat pocket. He was aware of the rolled drawings on the back seat. He was aware that neither of those things should be the opening move, that arriving with objects was the wrong kind of statement, that the only statement that mattered right now was the one you made by showing up and saying nothing that was self-serving. He got out of the car. He walked up the front path. The yard was bare and winter gray, and there were 2 hanging baskets on the porch that someone had planted with something cold weather, pansies or something like them, and he thought, she planted those. Even here, even like this, she had planted something. He knocked. He heard movement inside, a slow movement, the kind that had weight to it now, the kind that took longer than it used to. He thought about that, and something tightened in his throat. The door opened. Elena stood in the doorway in a heavy sweater and wool socks, and the specific stillness of a person who has just opened a door they expected to show them something ordinary, and instead found the thing they'd spent 2 months learning not to expect. She was 7 months pregnant, and she looked tired in the specific way of someone who had been holding something enormous alone for a very long time. And she was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face in 8 years. Not anger, not relief, not the complicated grief he'd been bracing for. Just a kind of flat, exhausted recognition, like a person who had suspected something was coming and now had confirmation, and the confirmation was neither better nor worse than the anticipating had been, just real. She said, "How did you find me?" "Marcus." "Of course." She held the door frame with one hand, not leaning, steadying. "What do you want, Damien?" He had rehearsed nothing that was adequate. He had driven 6 hours, and he had thought about what to say for 48 of the most grueling operational hours of his professional life. And he was standing in front of her, and the only true thing he had was the most inadequate thing possible. "I know," he said. "About the twins." The expression on Elena's face did something then. Not breaking. Elena didn't break. She hadn't broken in 2 months, and she wasn't going to break now in her own doorway. But something shifted in it. The specific shift of a person who has been carrying a secret in a place where secrets get very heavy and has just heard it named out loud by someone who was never supposed to know. She looked at him for a long moment. The December wind moved between them. "You should have known 2 months ago," she said. "Yes." "You should have been there when I found out." "Yes." "And you weren't." Her voice was not raised. It was worse than raised. It was the voice of a person who has already finished being angry and arrived somewhere past it, somewhere quieter and more permanent. "Because you were in your penthouse with my best friend." It wasn't... He stopped. He had promised himself he would not do this on a doorstep. He had promised himself he would not open with an explanation before he had opened with anything else. "You're right," he said. "You're completely right. Everything you're thinking right now is correct." She studied him. "Then why are you here?" "Because I should be." He said it without performance. "Because I was wrong, and I was late, and I can't fix either of those things. But I can be here now, and I'm going to be here now, whether or not you want that." Something moved across her face that he couldn't read. She shifted her weight, and he watched the effort of it, the physical reality of where she was in the pregnancy. And he had to clench his jaw to keep the thing that was happening in his chest from reaching his face, because this was not the moment for his grief, and he knew it. She said, "I'm not forgiving you." "I know. I'm not letting you back in." "I understand." "Then what exactly do you think being here accomplishes?" He held her gaze. "I don't know yet, but I'm not leaving." Elena looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had broken her in a kitchen in November, and who was now standing in her December doorway in Maine, with no plan and no performance, and for the first time in the 8 years she'd known him, nothing to offer her except the fact of his presence, which was simultaneously the least and the most he had ever given her. She said, "You're sleeping on the couch." She stepped back from the door. He walked in. He slept on the couch. It was too short for him by about 6 inches, and the throw blanket Elena left at the end of it smelled like her shampoo, which he recognized from 8 years of the same bottle on the same shelf in the same bathroom, and he lay there in the dark of her main living room staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around him and thought, this is what you traded, not the empire, not the organization. This, the ordinary nighttime sounds of a house where someone you love is sleeping down the hall, the way a wooden floor creaks when the temperature drops, the particular silence of a place far enough from any city that silence is actually quiet. He had traded this for pride, for Vanessa's architecture and Marcus's falsified files, and the story he'd needed to believe because the alternative was sitting with what he'd lost. He slept 3 hours, maybe 4. Elena was already in the kitchen when he woke. She moved carefully now, her hand finding the counter automatically as she shifted her weight, and he watched her from the doorway for 2 seconds before she registered him, and he forced himself not to offer help, because she hadn't asked for it. And offering help before you'd been asked was just another way of making yourself the center of something that wasn't about you. She said, "Coffee's done." He poured himself a cup and stood at the counter. She sat at the table with both hands around her mug, and the morning light came through the windows the way it did in winter, low and sideways. And she looked tired, but not fragile, which told him something about what these months had built in her. "You should know," he said, "that Reyes and the other 2 council members have been formally removed. Vanessa's separation from the organization was completed yesterday. The forged documents have been identified and pulled from the file system." She looked at him over her mug. "You came here to tell me that?" "I came here because you're 7 months pregnant and alone in December in Maine. I'm telling you that because you deserve to know the full picture." "The full picture," she repeated. There was no heat in it, just the flatness of someone tasting a phrase and finding it insufficient. "I know it doesn't—" "Damien," she set down her mug, "I understand what you did. I understand you dismantled something that needed dismantling, and I understand it probably cost you. And I don't dismiss that. But I need you to understand something." She looked at him directly, the way she had always been able to look at him, the way that had unnerved him when they first met, and that he'd come to understand was just her. Elena looked at things directly because looking away cost her more. "I didn't leave because of a conspiracy. I left because of what I saw with my own eyes before any conspiracy existed in your file system. And dismantling the conspiracy doesn't change what I saw." "I know. Do you?" "Yes." He held her gaze. "You saw me standing in our kitchen not pulling away. And you left because you trusted what you saw. And you were right to trust it, even though I would tell you the context was manufactured, because you couldn't have known that, and the image itself was enough. I'm not going to argue with what you saw." Something shifted in her expression. Minuscule. The specific shift of someone who has prepared to defend a position and found that the position isn't being attacked. She looked back at her coffee. "You're staying," she said. Not a question. "For as long as you let me." She nodded, very slightly. "You're buying groceries," she said, "if you're going to be here." "Tell me what you need." She pushed a list across the table. She'd had it ready, which told him she'd thought about this before he woke up, which told him something else about what these months had done to her. She had become practical in ways that had nothing to do with strategy, just the daily practicality of a woman managing a pregnancy alone, making lists, calculating needs, operating without the luxury of someone to share the weight. He took the list. He went to the store. He came back and put everything away in the right places because he paid attention to where she put things, and when he was done, she was asleep on the couch, with her feet up and a book on her chest, and he took the throw blanket he'd slept under and laid it over her and went and sat in the kitchen and drank another cup of coffee and did not let himself feel anything in particular about the size of what he was trying to earn back. You didn't earn things by feeling the size of them. You earned them by doing the next thing. He washed the dishes. 2 weeks passed with the specific texture of a ceasefire. Not peace, not war, just the careful daily negotiation of 2 people sharing a small house with a large unresolved thing between them. He slept on the couch. He made breakfast when she wasn't up yet. He drove her to her prenatal appointments and waited in the car because she hadn't invited him in, and he would wait in the car until she did. She was carrying twins, a boy and a girl, she told him on the 4th day without preamble, setting a plate down in front of him at dinner. A boy and a girl, James and Clara. She sat down. "I named them already. You can have opinions about the names, but I'm telling you what they are." "James and Clara," he said. "Yes." "They're good names." She picked up her fork. "I know they are." He almost smiled. He kept it mostly contained. She caught it anyway. She looked at her plate. She almost smiled too. She kept it more contained than he did, and that cost her something, and he saw that, and he did not say anything about it. On the 16th day, she let him come into the clinic. She didn't make an announcement about it. She just didn't tell him to wait in the car, and when she got out, he got out and fell into step beside her, and she walked through the door of the clinic like that was the plan she'd had all along. The midwife was a woman named Dr. Pierce, direct and unhurried, the kind of medical professional who had delivered enough babies in coastal Maine to have developed a serene indifference to the drama people carried into her office. She acknowledged Damien with a nod that communicated nothing about his weeks of car waiting and moved straight into the appointment. The ultrasound showed James first. He was head down and appeared, according to Dr. Pierce, to have been in this position for some time, apparently decided. Then Clara, positioned transverse, her head against her brother's back. "She's going to move when she's ready," Dr. Pierce said. "Second twin usually does." Damien watched the monitor. He had thought he was prepared for this, had told himself on the drive over that he would be composed because Elena needed composed, not a man falling apart in a clinic in Maine. He lasted about 4 seconds after the heartbeats appeared on the screen before something in his face did something he couldn't control, and he stopped trying to control it. He didn't make a sound. He just looked at the monitor. Elena, lying on the examination table with her face turned toward the screen, glanced at him once. She looked back at the monitor. After a moment, without looking at him again, she reached across the distance between the table and the chair and put her hand on his forearm. She didn't say anything. He put his other hand over hers. "Doctor." Pierce continued talking about positioning and the 32-week measurement and what to watch for over the next few weeks, and neither Damien nor Elena moved or spoke. And when it was over, they drove home in the near dark of a January afternoon, and she went inside and he sat in the driveway for a moment before following. "Thank you," he said at the door. She didn't ask what for. She just nodded and went to the kitchen and started making dinner, and he set the table without being asked, and they ate together in the kitchen with the winter pressing against the windows, and neither of them said anything about the clinic or the monitor or the fact that she'd reached across and touched his arm. Some things were too new to talk about yet. That was all right. It was a Thursday night in late January when everything accelerated. He was in the kitchen at 11:15, unable to sleep in the way he often couldn't sleep now. Not the old insomnia of an operational mind, but something more specific, the low-frequency alertness of someone waiting for something they couldn't name. He heard her. Not a cry. More like a sharp exhale, the sound of a person who has been startled by their own body. Then silence. Then her voice from the hallway. "Damien." The way she said his name, just 2 syllables, completely flat, but with something underneath them that moved him out of the kitchen before he'd consciously decided to move. She was standing in the hallway in her nightclothes with one hand on the wall and the other on her stomach, and her face had the specific quality of a person who is not panicking, because panic is a luxury, and they have already moved past it into something more functional and more frightening. "Something's wrong," she said. "How long?" 20 minutes. I thought it was... It's not Braxton Hicks. The pressure is... She stopped, her jaw going tight, and he watched her breathe through something, and when she came back, she said, "It's too early. 34 weeks. 6 weeks before the due date." "We're going," he said. "My bag." "I'll get your bag. Where is it?" "Closet, top shelf." He had it in 40 seconds. He had her in the car in 3 minutes, which involved helping her down the porch steps, in a way that required him to put his arm around her and take a portion of her weight, and neither of them said anything about that. It was just the physical fact of what was needed, and she let him because her body was doing something that required all of her attention, and she didn't have spare capacity for managing the complexity of being touched by him. The hospital was 22 minutes away. He did it in 16. She did not tell him to slow down, and she did not make a sound except for 2 more of those contained exhales at whatever was happening. And he drove with one hand and kept the other on the armrest between them, palm up, and she did not take it, but she did not move away from it either. Dr. Pierce met them in labor and delivery with an expression that told him she had received the call and had moved quickly and was now in the specific mode of medical professionals when a situation has declared its own urgency. She took Elena's vitals with her team while Damien stood against the wall in the way he'd been instructed. Out of the way, but not outside the room, a distinction Elena had made in a single look at the nurse who'd suggested the waiting area. 34 weeks is manageable, Dr. Pierce said, not stopping her work to say it, addressing Elena directly. James is well positioned. Clara... She looked at the monitor. Her voice stayed even. Clara has moved. She's no longer transverse. Is that good? Elena said. It's what we're working with. Which was not quite an answer. The next 2 hours were the longest of Damien's life, and he had lived a life that contained a significant quantity of long hours. He stood where he'd been put, in the left corner near the window where he could see Elena's face and the monitors both, and he watched. That was all he could do. He had spent 15 years building an organization on the principle that every problem had a solution if you had enough leverage and enough intelligence and enough will to apply them correctly. He had never before stood in a room where his leverage was zero and his intelligence was useless and his will had nowhere to go. Elena labored with the same specific stubbornness she brought to every difficult thing, which meant she did not yell and did not complain and only told the medical team what they asked her directly, and she breathed the way doctor. Pierce's nurse coached her, and she kept her eyes open, and when she reached a point that was beyond what she could navigate, with composure she turned her head and found Damien's eyes and held them. He did not look away. He crossed the room. No one told him not to. He took her hand and she gripped it hard with the strength of someone who has been doing this alone for a long time and has just reached the limit of alone. And he held on. James arrived at 2:41 a.m. He was small, 5 pounds, 3 ounces, and he was loud about the indignity of it, and the sound of him filled the room, and Elena made a sound that Damien had never heard from her before, something that had no name, and he was still holding her hand. Then the monitors changed. Dr. Pierce's voice shifted. Not louder, just faster. The nurses moved with the specific efficiency of people responding to something they had trained for and hoped not to use. Damien heard the words cord compression and fetal heart rate and we need to move, and he understood approximately half of the clinical content and 100% of the emotional content, which was Clara was in trouble. Elena understood it all. Go, she said to Dr. Pierce. Do what you need. I need you to... I know. Go. They moved. The room reorganized around Clara's crisis with a speed that left no space for anything else, and Damien was displaced to the edge again, holding James. Someone had put James in his arms in the reorganization, wrapped and warm and astonishingly present, this small, furious person, and he stood there with his son in his arms, watching the team work on his daughter, and he thought very clearly, if she doesn't make it, I will not survive it. Not dramatically, not as a performance of grief. Just as a fact, the way facts land when you are standing in a delivery room at 3 a.m. with your son in your arms and your daughter's heartbeat on a monitor that is doing things you do not understand, and you are aware for the first time in your life that you are entirely powerless, that there is nothing in your history or your resources or your particular brand of controlled ruthlessness that is relevant to this moment. The monitor steadied. It took 4 minutes. He counted them, the digital clock on the wall, the same way Elena had counted floors in an elevator 2 months ago, though he didn't know that. And then the monitor steadied, and Dr. Pierce said something to her team in a tone that had a different quality in it, and Clara arrived at 3:09 a.m., 4 pounds 11 ounces, furious in her own quieter way, her cries smaller than her brother's but present, completely present, filling the space it needed to fill. Damien's knees did something. He locked them. He stood. He looked at Elena. She was looking at him already, exhausted beyond any exhaustion he had words for, her hair dark with sweat against the pillow, her eyes bright with something that was either tears or the specific light of a person who has just come through something and is still processing that they're on the other side of it. He walked to her. He still had James. He sat in the chair beside her bed, and he held James so she could see both of them. And when the nurse brought Clara and laid her in Elena's arms, Elena looked down at her daughter for a long moment, and then she looked up at Damien. She said, "She's okay." "She's okay," he confirmed. Elena nodded. She looked back at Clara. Her face did the thing it had been trying not to do in front of him for 2 months. It let go of something, not a collapse, just a release, the specific release of a face that has been holding a particular expression so long that the muscles have forgotten how to do anything else. And finally, in this room at 3 a.m. with both babies present and both heartbeats confirmed, the muscles remembered. He did not say anything. He just sat there with James in his arms and watched Elena hold Clara and let the moment be exactly what it was. Not a resolution, not a forgiveness, not the beginning of something repaired. Just a room, just 4 people, 2 of them newborn, 2 of them wrecked and exhausted and sitting closer together than they had been in 2 months. Just that. By 6 in the morning, the babies were in the NICU for observation, standard procedure for early twins, and Elena was in a room on the maternity floor and Damien was in a chair beside her bed, and she was asleep almost before the nurses finished their last check. He did not sleep. He sat in the chair and looked at her sleeping and thought about the apartment in New York where her coat hooks were empty, and the elevator she'd ridden down alone, and the diner parking lot in Connecticut where she'd called her mother from a payphone, and the main house where she'd planted cold weather flowers on the porch, even in the middle of everything, because that was the kind of person she was, the kind of person who planted something even when she wasn't sure how long she'd be staying. He thought about James and Clara in the NICU, 4 floors up, each under 5 pounds, born 6 weeks early into a world that had been trying to complicate their existence before they'd had the chance to exist. He thought about what Elena had said. "I'm not forgiving you. I'm not letting you back in." She'd said it standing in her doorway a month ago, and she'd meant it, and nothing that had happened since then had changed it formally. He was sleeping on the couch. She had reached across in the clinic and put her hand on his arm. She had said his name in the hallway at 11:15 with the specific tone of someone who had a list of people they could call and had called the right one. These were not forgiveness, but they were something. They were the raw material of something, the kind of thing that only becomes visible in retrospect, when you can look back at a sequence of small moments and see the direction they were building toward. He was not going to name the direction yet. That was not his to name. He was just going to sit here in this chair until she woke up. And when she woke up, he was going to ask her what she needed, and he was going to get it, and he was going to do that again tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day after that for as long as it took for the direction to become clear enough that she was the one who named it. He owed her that much. He owed her considerably more than that. But that was where you started, with what you could do right now, in this chair, in this room, while the Maine winter pressed against the window, and his daughter breathed in the NICU 4 floors up, and his son slept beside her, and the woman he had failed most profoundly in his adult life slept 6 feet away with the specific exhaustion of someone who had just done the hardest thing she'd ever done, largely because she'd had no other choice, and had done it without breaking. The light changed as morning came, gray to white to the thin gold of a January sun that didn't have enough heat in it to matter but was present anyway, doing what it could with what it had. Damien watched it move across the floor. He thought, "I am going to be different, not a promise, not a declaration, just a fact, the same way certain facts landed, quietly, without drama, with the weight of something that had already decided to be true before you got around to saying it." He sat in the chair. He waited for her to wake up. Elena woke at 7:43. He knew the exact time because he'd been watching the clock on the wall with the specific attention of a man who has run out of anything else to do with his hands, and when she stirred, he looked away from the clock and toward her and waited. She didn't open her eyes immediately. She surfaced the way people surface from deep exhaustion, slowly, in stages, the body checking its inventory before it committed to consciousness. Her hand moved first, finding the blanket edge. Then her face changed, the muscles reorganizing from sleep into wakefulness. And somewhere in that reorganization, she remembered everything. He could see the moment it landed, the slight tension that moved through her. She opened her eyes. He was there. He watched her register that, watched her decide what to do with it. "The babies," she said. 4 floors up. I checked at 6. They were both stable, both feeding. The night nurse said Clara's numbers improved overnight. She exhaled. Long, slow, the specific exhale of someone releasing something they'd been holding even in sleep. "You should have woken me." "You needed to sleep." "Damien." "You needed to sleep," he said again, not arguing, just stating. "I was awake. I would have gotten you if anything changed." She looked at him in the way she had of looking at things she hadn't decided about yet. Not hostile, not warm, just direct, her eyes doing the inventory the way her hands had done under the blanket, taking stock. "You look terrible," she said. "I know. When did you last sleep?" "I'll sleep later." That's not an answer. "Day before yesterday." He said it without inflection. "I'm fine." She looked at him for another moment, then she pushed herself upright and he moved to help and she let him, which was different from the first weeks in the main house when she'd managed every physical thing herself with a pointed deliberateness that communicated exactly what it was meant to communicate. She let him adjust the pillows. She let him pour water from the pitcher on the nightstand and hand it to her. She drank. She set the cup down. "I want to see them," she said. "I'll get the nurse." The NICU had the quality of all NICUs, hushed, warm, calibrated to the specific fragility of what was kept inside it. The nurse who walked them in had the manner of someone accustomed to parents who arrived having slept badly and feeling the particular helplessness of people who are used to being able to fix things. James was in the incubator nearest the door, his face turned sideways with an expression of profound grievance at the general situation. He was 4 days old and already appeared to have opinions. Clara was beside him, smaller, her eyes closed, her chest moving with a steadiness that Damien watched for several seconds before he let himself look at anything else. Elena stood between the two incubators. She put her hand through the access port and touched James's cheek with 2 fingers, very gently, and James's expression shifted slightly, not quite settling, more like acknowledging. Then she moved to Clara and did the same thing, and Clara turned her head a centimeter toward the touch, the instinctive animal gravity of a newborn finding a warm thing. Elena said nothing for a long time. Damien stood back. This was not his moment to insert himself. He understood that. He watched Elena meet her children in the specific way of a mother who has been carrying them alone for 7 months, and is now standing on the other side of that, looking at the tangible result of every hard decision she'd made. Every morning she'd woken up alone in the White House and made the list and done the next thing. He understood what he was looking at. He understood it in a way he hadn't understood anything in a long time. He was looking at what strength actually looked like, not the kind he'd spent 15 years building, not the strength of leverage and intelligence and controlled ruthlessness, the kind that didn't have a name you could put on a building or a contract, the kind that got up in the morning and planted flowers on a porch even when it wasn't sure how long it was staying. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and looked at the wall. Her mother arrived on the second day. Patricia Ashford drove up from Connecticut in a car packed with things Elena hadn't asked for and needed desperately. Proper food, the kind made in someone's kitchen rather than a hospital cafeteria, 3 pairs of warm socks, a blanket Elena had had since college that Patricia had kept in the Connecticut house for reasons she'd never articulated. She came through the hospital room door with the specific forward momentum of a woman who has been waiting for permission to arrive for 2 months and has finally received it, and she stopped when she saw Damien. The stop lasted approximately 1 second. Then she looked at Elena, who was sitting up in the bed, and said, "You look thin." "I'm fine, Mom." "I brought soup." Patricia set the bag down and looked at Damien again. Not hostile, assessing, the particular assessment of a woman who loves someone and is evaluating the things standing near them. "Mr. Draven." "Mrs. Ashford." "Patricia." She said it as a correction, not a warmth. "I assume you're the reason my daughter spent 2 months not returning my calls." "Indirectly," Damien said. "Yes." Patricia looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at Elena. Something passed between them that he wasn't meant to read and didn't try to. "I want to see my grandchildren," Patricia said. "4th floor," Elena said. "I'll come with you." They went up together and left him in the room, and he sat in the chair and looked at the soup Patricia had set on the bedside table, which was still in a container from a deli in Greenwich that Elena had been going to since she was 12 years old. And he thought about Elena at 12 in a deli in Greenwich, and about every year between then and now, and about how thoroughly he had failed to be worthy of what she'd given him. He ate the soup because she'd left it there, and it seemed wrong to waste it. When they came back, Patricia sat in the second chair, and Elena got back into the bed, and they talked about the babies with the specific, exhausted joy of women processing something enormous, and Damien sat in the corner and listened, and did not participate unless directly addressed, which he thought was correct. At one point, Patricia said to Elena, but with full awareness of the room, "Is he staying?" Elena said, "He's staying for now." Patricia said, "For now." Elena said, "Mom." Patricia said, "I'm just repeating what you said," and picked up her coffee with an expression of complete innocence that told him exactly where Elena had gotten her particular brand of directness. Vanessa Cole was dealt with on a Tuesday. Not by Damien directly. That had been deliberate. He had the documentation, Marcus had the documentation, the organizational board had already acted. What remained was the civil matter, and he had instructed his attorneys to pursue it with the same thoroughness they applied to everything while he was in Maine with Elena and the babies. He learned what happened through a phone call from his lead attorney on a Tuesday afternoon, standing in the parking lot of the hospital while Elena napped. She took the settlement, the attorney said. Full asset forfeiture on the 3 accounts we identified, signed NDAs, departure from the city. She'll relocate to her family's property in Portugal under the terms. Reyes. Federal matter now. The financial fraud documentation was passed to the appropriate authority through the board's external counsel. We have no further involvement. Castellano? The alliance proposal has been formally withdrawn. His daughter sent a personal note for what it's worth. Damien said, "It's worth nothing." That's what I assumed. He stood in the parking lot in the cold and thought about Vanessa in Portugal. He thought about 11 years. He thought about the kitchen in the penthouse, the staging of it, the patience it required to stand in a man's home and orchestrate the thing that would most efficiently destroy what he loved. He didn't feel what he'd expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not the specific cold completion of a handled problem, just something flat and tired, like looking at the site of a demolished building. The building was gone. That was the fact of it. Everything that had stood there was gone. Transfer the Portugal settlement costs to the organizational account, he said. I don't want it on my personal books. Done. That's all. He stood in the parking lot until he was too cold to stand there anymore. Then he went back inside. The babies came home 12 days after they were born. Home was the White House in Maine because Elena hadn't been asked to go anywhere else, and Damien hadn't suggested it. He'd driven back to the house twice during the hospital stay to prepare it. A second trip that Elena didn't know about, where he'd spent a day assembling the cribs that had been delivered, setting up the changing area, making the second bedroom into something that was ready rather than just emptied. When Elena walked into the second bedroom for the first time and saw it, she stopped in the doorway. He waited. She said, "You did this?" Marcus sent the delivery. I assembled. When? Week before they were born, and again 3 days ago. She looked at the cribs. Side by side the way she'd mentioned once, briefly, that she'd read twin siblings did better when they could hear each other breathing. He'd remembered that. He'd positioned them accordingly. She stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then she walked in and ran her hand along the rail of Clara's crib and said nothing, and he understood that the nothing was not absence. It was the sound of someone who has been given something they needed and doesn't yet have the language for what to do with that. "Thank you," she said finally. "You don't have to—" "Damien," she turned. "Let me say it." "Okay. Thank you." "You're welcome." Patricia stayed for the first week. She slept in the living room, which meant Damien's couch was occupied, and he slept in his car one night, and then Elena told him, without looking at him, that there was a cot in the garage closet from the previous tenants, and he could put it in the hallway, and he did. The hallway cot was 4 feet from the baby's room, and he was aware of every sound that came through the door, which meant he was functionally awake most of the night anyway. He changed James at 3 a.m. on the second night because Elena had done the 1 a.m. and Patricia had done the 2 a.m., and when the 3 a.m. cries started, he was already in the hallway, and he went in before anyone else could. He'd never changed a diaper. He stood in the dim room with James making his displeasure audible and thought, there must be logic to this. All physical problems have logic, and worked it out with the same methodical approach he applied to everything, and by the end it was done. And James, wrapped back up and slightly suspicious, regarded him from the changing table with an expression of cautious reassessment. "We're both figuring it out," Damien told him. James made a sound. "I'll take that as agreement." He picked him up and walked him in the small space of the room until the crying wound down, and then put him back in the crib, and stood there until the breathing steadied, and then stood there a little longer just because. Patricia appeared in the doorway at some point. He didn't know how long she'd been there. She said nothing. She looked at him for a moment and then went back down the hall, and he heard her settle back into the living room. In the morning, she made breakfast for everyone, and she set a plate in front of Damien without comment, and when Elena wasn't looking, she met his eyes briefly and nodded. One small, precise nod, the kind that meant something specific and private and that he received and kept. Patricia left on a Friday. She hugged Elena for a long time in the doorway, and she hugged the babies one at a time, and she looked at Damien and said, Don't make me regret not having an opinion about you. I'll try, he said. Try harder than that, she said, and got in her car and drove south. He and Elena stood on the porch and watched the car until it turned at the end of the road. The cold was significant today, the kind that came off the water and had intention to it. Clara was inside asleep. James was in the carrier against Damien's chest because James had decided, around day 5, that horizontal surfaces were for other people, and that upright and moving was the correct state of being, a preference that Damien had come to understand was not negotiable. They stood on the porch for a moment after Patricia's car disappeared. Elena said, "She likes you." She said not to make her regret not having an opinion. For my mother, that's basically a declaration of affection. He looked at the road. Good to know. She pulled her coat closer. I need to talk to you about something. His chest did the thing. Okay. She looked at the tree line. Margaret called about the divorce proceedings. The 90-day period has been extended twice already because of everything. She needs a direction. The word direction sat between them with its full weight. What direction do you want to give her? He said. I don't know yet. She said it plainly, not as deflection. I know what I don't want. I don't want to make a decision because I'm grateful or because the babies were born and it feels like things have shifted. Gratitude isn't the same as trust. No, he agreed. And trust takes time, he said. I know. She turned to look at him. I'm not asking you to leave. I know that too. But I'm not. Elena. He said her name carefully, the way you said something fragile. I understand exactly where we are. I'm not waiting for a decision. I'm just here. That's all. She studied him. You're the most patient I've ever seen you. I have more to lose now than I've ever had. He looked down at James, who was asleep against his chest with the absolute confidence of someone who had decided this was a reliable, warm thing. I'm aware of that. She was quiet for a moment. Call Margaret, she said. Tell her we need another 60 days. I'll tell her. And Damien? She stopped. She looked at the tree line again, then back at him. Don't sleep on the cot anymore. It's absurd. You're 6 feet tall and it's a cot. Where do you suggest? I have a couch, she said. An actual couch. In the living room. That fits a person. I know. I slept on it for 2 weeks. Well, you can sleep on it again. She went back inside, pulling the door and leaving it open behind her, meaning he was expected to follow. He followed. The weeks that followed had a texture he hadn't expected. Not warmth exactly, not the warmth of before. Nothing was going to be the warmth of before, and he'd stopped hoping for that, had made his peace with the fact that what he was building was a different thing entirely, something with different dimensions, earned in different currency. But something. A working arrangement that had the ordinary friction of 2 people managing 2 infants and a household and the accumulated weight of everything that had happened. And that friction was real and sometimes difficult and occasionally sharp, and it was infinitely preferable to the alternative. He cooked because cooking was something concrete he could do and because Elena was still recovering, and because James had identified him as an acceptable sleeping surface, which meant he was often stationary for 20 to 40-minute stretches during the day, and there was nothing to do during those stretches except think. And thinking too much in one direction wasn't useful, so cooking from scratch had become his form of not thinking. Elena came into the kitchen one afternoon while he was working through something complicated involving leaks, and found him with a knife in one hand and reading glasses he'd finally admitted he needed on his face, squinting at a recipe on his phone. She stopped. What? He said, not looking up. Nothing, she said. He looked up. She had an expression he hadn't seen on her face, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd seen that expression. Something between amusement and something softer. Reading glasses, she said. I'm 41. I know how old you are. I've needed them for 2 years. I was too proud, she said. I was going to say stubborn. Same thing, she said, and went to the refrigerator, and he could hear in the quality of the silence she produced that she was containing a smile, and he looked back at his leaks and contained one himself. These were the moments, not the large ones, not the clinic or the delivery room or the porch conversation about Margaret. The small ones, the reading glasses, the 3 a.m. diaper. The morning she'd come into the kitchen to find he'd remembered she took her coffee with 1 sugar and no milk, and that her preferred mug was the blue one with a chip on the handle, not the new one Patricia had brought. He'd remembered, and she'd picked up the mug and just held it for a moment before she said anything else. These were the moments that actually built things. He understood that now in a way he couldn't have articulated a year ago. Grand gestures were easy. Consistency was the hard thing. The daily choosing to be present, to pay attention, to remember the chip on the handle, that was the work. That was the thing that either happened or didn't, and you couldn't perform it because the performance fell apart after a week, and what was left was either the truth or the absence of it. He was trying to be the truth. The conversation about New York happened on a night in March, 5 weeks after the twins came home, when both babies were asleep and the house had that rare quality of actual quiet, and Elena had made tea and they were sitting at the kitchen table in the way they'd been doing more often. Not because anything had been agreed to, but because the kitchen table was where the evenings tended to end up. She said, "Reyes's federal case is moving faster than they expected. I saw it in the news." "Yes." "The Castellano situation." "Resolved. His shipping interests have been formally separated from any organizational connection. Clean cut." She held her mug. "And the organization itself?" He'd been waiting for this question, not with dread, with the specific patience of a person who knows a conversation is coming and has thought about how to have it honestly. "I've been restructuring," he said, "separating the legitimate holdings, real estate, the development subsidiaries, the hospitality portfolio, into a standalone entity. Clean books, external board, no overlap with anything that can't survive daylight. And the parts that can't survive daylight. I'm stepping back." He said it without drama. "Not overnight. It doesn't work overnight without creating a vacuum that's more dangerous than a managed exit. But there's a timeline. Marcus is managing the transition. 18 months. She looked at him. 18 months. Possibly less. Why 18 months? Because doing it in 6 months would leave gaps that someone else would fill badly. Because the people who've worked for me for a long time deserve an exit that doesn't destroy them. Because... He stopped. Because I want James and Clara to be able to Google their father's name in 20 years without finding something I can't explain to them. Elena was quiet for a long moment. "That's the first time," she said. "First time what?" "That you've mentioned them in the context of the future. Your future with them. Not just what's happening now." He looked at the table. "I think about it all the time," he said. "I just didn't know if I had the right to say it to you yet." She turned her mug in her hands, clockwise, then back. He'd watched her do that 100 times in 8 years. It was her thinking gesture, the physical expression of something being considered. "I bought a house," he said. She looked up. 3 streets over, about a 10-minute walk. He held her gaze. "Not here. Not this house. I'm not assuming anything about this house or what it means that I'm in it. But I needed somewhere that was mine, somewhere the kids could have a room that was theirs, somewhere that..." He stopped again. "Somewhere that said I was staying, regardless." "Regardless," she repeated, "of what you decide, about Margaret, about the divorce, about any of it." He looked at her steadily. "I'm staying in this town. I'm going to be 3 streets over, and I'm going to show up every day, and I'm going to be their father, and I'm going to be whatever you'll let me be to you, but I'm not leaving the zip code." She looked at him for a long time, the kind of looking that took inventory, the kind he'd learned not to try to manage or interpret while it was happening. "When did you buy it?" she said. 6 weeks ago. When you were still sleeping on the cot. When I was still sleeping on the cot. You bought a house in a town you'd been in for 3 weeks. I've made faster decisions with worse information," he said. She looked at the table. She looked at her tea. She looked back at him. "Show me," she said. "Now?" "Tomorrow, when the babies are down for morning nap." She stood up. "Show me the house." The house was white clapboard, older than Elena's rental, with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides and windows that needed repainting, and a kitchen that had been redone sometime in the 90s with the cheerful optimism of that decade's design sensibilities, meaning it was not optimal, but it had good bones and good light. Elena walked through it without saying much. She touched door frames. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the window above the sink for a while. She went upstairs and stood in the room he'd designated as the twins' room, which had southern exposure and a built-in window seat that would be exactly the right size for two children sitting with books when they were 7 or 8 years old, and she looked at the window seat for a moment and then looked at him. "You saw the window seat," she said. "That's why I bought it." She looked at it again. She sat down on it, testing. It was solid. "The kitchen," she said. I know. I know what the kitchen is. I was going to redo it." "With what vision, exactly?" "I was going to ask an architect." The pause that followed had a different quality than their pauses usually had. He'd gotten good at reading the texture of Elena's silences. "I still have my license," she said casually, not looking at him. "I know. I haven't worked in 7 months. I know that too. Starting with a kitchen is usually how people ease back in." She stood up from the window seat. She walked back to the doorway and stopped. "I'm not promising anything. I'm not asking you to." She looked at him, directly, the way she always had, the way that had unnerved him when they first met, and that he understood now was the thing he'd loved most about her from the very beginning, the refusal to look away from things, even things that were inconvenient or painful or not yet decided. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She went back downstairs. He followed. She stood on the porch and looked at the street, at the houses with their winter yards and the bare trees and the specific quality of late winter Maine light that was not yet spring but was considering it. "Call Margaret," she said. "Tell her we're putting it on hold." He was very still. "Not 60 days." "No." She kept looking at the street. "On hold. Indefinitely. I'm not deciding anything from here." "Okay," he said. "I'm not—" She stopped. "I don't know what I'm saying yes to. I know what I'm saying no to, which is making a final decision in either direction while I'm still—" She stopped again. "While everything is still happening." "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." She looked at him then, finally. "Don't make it more than it is." "I'm not. You have a particular face right now. I'm just standing here. You're doing the face." He looked at the street. "I'll work on the face." She almost laughed. It was a small, tired, real sound, the kind that wasn't trying to be anything other than what it was. He felt it like a change in air pressure. "Come on," she said. "The babies will be up soon." They walked back to her house, the 3 streets, and the late winter air was cold enough that their breath made small clouds. And they walked without touching, but without the careful distance of the first weeks either. Just the natural proximity of 2 people walking the same direction with their hands in their own pockets, and no particular need to announce anything about it. Mutz. Spring came in stages the way it always did on the Maine coast, grudgingly, incompletely. The warmth arriving for a day and then retreating for a week until finally in late April it committed, and the trees at the back of Elena's yard began showing green, and she brought the porch planters out from the garage and planted them with something that would actually get color, real color, petunias, and something trailing that she told him the name of, and he forgot immediately, and she rolled her eyes. He was there most days. Not all day. He had the house 3 streets over, and he had calls and his restructuring work and the ordinary infrastructure of a life being rebuilt with different priorities. But most days, at some point, he was at the kitchen table or in the yard or on the floor with James and Clara while they conducted their ongoing investigation of the world from a horizontal position. James had started rolling. This was apparently significant, and he'd been told about it by Elena and Patricia in their respective phone calls. And by the moment he arrived to see it for himself, James had already decided rolling was old news and was apparently working on something more ambitious involving pulling himself toward objects. "He's going to walk before he crawls," Elena said, watching him from the couch. "Is that normal?" "Clara's going to crawl first. Watch her." He watched Clara, who was on her stomach regarding the world with an expression of serious concentration, her legs doing something methodical and experimental that looked very much like the early stages of a plan. "You're right," he said. "I know." She turned a page of the architectural journal she'd started reading again. "I'm right about the children. It's you I'm still working out." He looked at her. She was looking at the journal. "Fair," he said. She turned another page. She had a pencil behind her ear, the old habit from work, and she hadn't appeared to notice it was there. He noticed. He didn't say anything. "The kitchen design," she said. "For the house. I've been thinking about it." "You don't have to." "I want to." She said it simply. "I have thoughts, and I want to see if you'll actually trust someone else's architectural judgment, or if you'll be insufferable about it." "I'll defer entirely," he said. "You won't." "I'll defer on most things." "That I believe." She turned another page. "I'll draw something up." He looked at the ceiling. He thought, do not make too much of this. He thought, just let it be what it is. He was getting better at that. Not good. Better. Dude. The summer arrived and the coastal town became briefly, cheerfully noisy, with people who'd driven up from the cities, and Elena acquired a jogging stroller that held two and started using it in the mornings when the air was still cool. And Damien, who had never been a runner, found himself running beside her by the third week of June without anyone having proposed this arrangement. They ran to the point at the edge of town and back, 4 miles, 3 mornings a week. They didn't talk much when they ran. That was the thing about running. It organized itself around breathing rather than conversation, and he'd come to appreciate that, the way a sustained physical thing could be shared without requiring language. One morning in July, she stopped at the point, the way she sometimes did, to look at the water. The ocean was flat and silver that morning, the way it got before the day's wind started, and the town behind them was still quiet. She said, "Do you miss it?" "What specifically?" "The empire," she said. What you built. The weight of it." He thought about it honestly. No. He thought some more. "I miss being certain. I knew exactly what I was doing for a very long time. Every decision sat inside a framework I understood completely. I miss the certainty. But not the thing itself. The thing itself cost me you." He said it without performance. Hard to miss a thing that did that. She looked at the water for a moment. "I missed you," she said. "In Maine. Those first months." She said it to the water, not to him. "I was furious, and I was right to leave, and I would leave again if I went back to that night. And I missed you." Both things were true. "Elena, I'm not saying it as an opening." She turned to look at him. "I'm saying it because it's true, and I spent 7 months not saying true things out loud, and I'm done doing that." He held her gaze. "Okay. I also missed Vanessa," she said, "which is its own thing to figure out. Yes, she was my best friend for 22 years. I know. So there's that." She looked back at the water. "I can be angry at her and also grieve her. Those can both be true." "They can." She nodded, to herself more than to him. She turned and started running back toward the town, and he fell into step beside her. He thought about Vanessa in Portugal. He thought about Reyes in a federal holding facility awaiting trial. He thought about Margaret Hale's file with its indefinite hold status, and the ring that he'd moved from his coat pocket to the nightstand at his house, not because he had plans for it, but because it belonged somewhere it could be seen. He thought about 12 months ago, when he'd come home to an empty apartment and a weight in the air that he hadn't understood until much later. He ran. Clara took her first steps in October. She'd been working up to it for 2 weeks in the way she worked up to things. Methodically, seriously, with the focused determination that had been hers since the delivery room, since Dr. Pierce had said she's not transverse anymore with that particular quality in her voice. Clara did things when she decided to do them and not before, and when she decided she was ready, she pulled herself up on the edge of the coffee table and took 3 steps toward Elena, who was sitting on the floor 2 feet away with her hands held out. 3 steps. She landed against Elena's chest, and Elena caught her and held her, and Clara made a sound of pure satisfaction. James, watching from the playmat with his characteristic expression of acute interest in what other people were doing, immediately pulled himself to standing on the coffee table leg and looked at his sister with an expression that said, "Wait for me." Damien was sitting on the floor with his back against the couch. He didn't move. He sat there and watched Elena hold Clara, and he watched James work himself up to his own attempt. And he thought about the list Elena had made on the night she left, in a hotel room in November with her coat still on, the list that ended with the word Maine, and a question mark. He thought about how far from that question mark they were now. Not at an answer. He didn't think in those terms anymore, didn't think in terms of conclusions or final states, because he'd learned that the things worth having didn't arrive at conclusions. They just kept going, kept being built, kept requiring the daily act of choosing them. Elena looked up. She found him across the room. She had Clara in her arms and something on her face that wasn't quite a smile yet, but was moving in that direction. And he thought about the first time she'd looked at him like that. 8 years ago in his office, making an argument about structural load-bearing, pretending not to be impressed. And about every version of that look between then and now, all the different things it had meant in different rooms in different years. This version was the one he'd earned least of and valued most. He thought, this is the empire. Not the buildings, not the assets now being transferred into clean-handed subsidiaries, not the Draven name on corporate filings. This room, this woman. These two small people who had arrived 6 weeks early into a complicated world and were figuring it out with the same determined pragmatism as their mother. Clara reached toward him from Elena's arms, small hand, opening and closing, the specific reach of a 10-month-old who has identified something she wants to move toward. He held out his hand. She grabbed his finger. He looked at Elena. Elena looked at him. Neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said right now, and they had both spent enough of their lives filling silences that were better left alone. Some things earned their silence. Some rooms were exactly right at exactly the right temperature, and you didn't open a window in them, you just sat in them and let them be what they were. Outside, the October coast wind moved through the trees at the edge of the yard. The same wind that had been there the night Elena arrived in Maine alone in November. The same trees, the same sound she'd heard through the window of her rented house and thought was someone whispering in a language just beyond understanding. She understood it now, or she was closer to understanding it. That was the thing about languages. You didn't arrive at fluency in a moment. You built it word by word, day by day, through the sustained effort of showing up and paying attention and being willing to be wrong and trying again. She was still trying. He was still trying. James, having committed to the attempt, let go of the coffee table leg and took 2 lurching steps and sat down hard on the rug and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the ceiling is exactly where he left it, which was both irritating and reassuring. 2 steps, Damien said. 3 for Clara, Elena said. He'll catch up. He always does. She kissed the top of Clara's head. She looked at Damien. Stay for dinner, she said. It was not a question. It was not yet an opening, and she wasn't calling it one. It was just what it was, an invitation to a kitchen table at the end of an October afternoon in a small Maine town, which was both the smallest possible thing and the largest one Damien Draven had been offered in a year. Okay, he said. He picked James up off the rug. James regarded him with his father's eyes and his mother's expression and the particular uncomplicated confidence of a 10-month-old who had just tried something and failed and was already planning the next attempt. Damien carried him to the kitchen. Elena followed with Clara. The door was open. Outside, the late afternoon light was doing what October light did on the Maine coast, going golden and long-shadowed, the kind of light that made ordinary things look like they'd been chosen specifically, like someone had arranged them. The trees, the yard, the cold-weather flowers Elena had planted in the porch planters in April that had finally, by this late in the season, gone to seed. She'd plant something else in spring. She always did. She was that kind of person, the kind who planted something, who put the roots in and waited, who came back to tend it, even when she wasn't sure what it would become. Damien understood now that he'd spent 15 years building the wrong thing. He was starting to understand what the right thing looked like. It looked like this. It looked like a kitchen table and a child on each hip and a woman moving to the stove with the quiet focused purpose of someone who has survived the worst year of her life and is now making dinner. It was not perfect. It was not whole yet. It was the beginning of something, and it had earned every small step it had taken to get here, and it would require every small step still ahead, and he was going to take them. All of them, one at a time, starting with dinner.